Well, good morning, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and well, there goes the Ospreys welcoming us back here to Mystery Island Studio. We've had a great vacation, but we are back now, and very glad to have the opportunity today, in particular, to talk to Harley Schlanger. Harley has been very busy covering current events. He has his daily Larouche Organization.com broadcast, as well as writing a great many articles. So it's really a privilege for me and for us at McDuff Channel here to have Harley with us. So good morning and actually good afternoon to you, Harley Schlanger. How are you today?
I'm fine, John. I hope you had a chance to rest a little bit on your vacation.
Oh, it was wonderful. We went to the beach in North Carolina, where it's still April, so it's never going to get over about 70. But we had pretty much the beach to ourselves, and we love that. So I'm not too keen to get in the water at this temperature, but as far as enjoying walking in the sand and just playing with the dogs and a week off, it was just right. So thank you for that, and once again, thanks for being with us. I did watch your morning show yesterday, and I loved the conclusion of it. I felt like, wow, Harley's taking the gloves off here. And the end of the broadcast, after making the case very strongly for exactly this, the end of the broadcast was to say that it's time that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain be put in a coffin. Wow, that says it in a nutshell, and in a metaphorical nutshell of a coffin. Wow. So, what is it that finally? I say finally. To me, it seems like that is it. That's like almost a declaration of war against this relationship, and that does seem to be the solution to me. And I say bravo, bravissimo for saying that. So let's share with the world your thoughts that went into that declaration. Why did it come to this?
Well, the specific reference was to an article which appeared in the Daily Mirror about the relationship between Richard Moore, who's the current head of MI6, and President Zelensky of Ukraine. And so what we find is that Zelensky had a 2-hour meeting with Moore, who gave him some instructions, which included shut down the opposition media, which Zelensky then went on to do. He did some censorship, some sanctions, threats to close them down completely, accused them of being owned by Russians when they're actually owned by Ukrainian oligarchs, the opposition press. But then, really interesting, he told Zelensky to work with Erdogan of Turkey. Now, Moore, who is the current head of MI6, was previously ambassador to Turkey. He speaks Turkish fluently, and Zelensky has now had 2 meetings with Erdogan. Erdogan is the beneficiary of an extremely, I guess you'd say, liberal arms deal, series of arms deals with the British. And he's been making those arms available, for example, to Azerbaijan in their recent skirmish with Armenia, with Azerbaijan, in a sense, more of a Turkic nation, and Armenia, a Christian nation allied to Russia. And so the Azerbaijanis had these new weapons that the Turks gave them, and it was very effective in the war against Armenia. But now what Zelensky and Erdogan talked about was the possibility of closing down the Black Sea to Russian traffic through the isthmus there, the Istanbul, to keep Russia somewhat landlocked, and to talk about also Erdogan's support for Crimea going back to Ukraine, because the present crisis with Ukraine was triggered by Zelensky on March 24th saying that Crimea will always belong to Ukraine and Ukraine is going to take it back. So that was the particular immediate cause of my emphasis on the importance of breaking this special relationship. But then I just saw something a few minutes ago, which really was telling. I did another article, which is getting very wide circulation, about the Caesar sanctions and the hypocrisy of the State Department coming out saying that in order to protect the children of Syria, we're going to carry out these sanctions, which, according to Cardinal Zanari, who is the Pope's representative, the papal nuncio in Syria, 90% of the Syrian population is now below poverty level, and about half the children are suffering from malnutrition. So I saw two videos that just really highlight the evil of this policy. One is Secretary of State Blinken, who's the one who's taken these sanctions that were the product of Pompeo and escalated. And Blinken said, when I think of what's happening to the children of Syria, meaning because of Assad, I look into the eyes of my own two young children and think of the importance of carrying this through to protect those children in Syria. Now, is he not aware that these sanctions are killing children in Syria, just as the Clinton sanctions against Saddam Hussein in the 90s killed 500,000 Iraqi children? Is Blinken completely unaware of that? I don't think so. And so this one clip of him saying that shows what an unbelievable hypocritical bastard he is. But then, very funny, there's a clip of him playing electric guitar, singing Coochie Coochie Baby or something like that. And you wonder where this is taking place, because he's supposedly so hip and so young. And you find out it was at the ambassador from Britain's house, Sir Kim Darroch, who was the ambassador that had to leave during the Trump period because of his reports to his seniors in Whitehall about how to control the Trump administration. And specifically, Sir Kim said, we need Trump whisperers who will whisper in Trump's ears, or whoever's in power's ears, what we want them to do. And so here you see Blinken in a totally informal mode, playing rock music, rock guitar in Lord Darroch's house. Obviously, he's the beneficiary of the British whispering that's going on. So you put all that together, and what you see is that we have the hapless Joe Biden, who's surrounded by people who essentially think the way the Brits do. Another important person, Susan Rice, Oxford Rhodes Scholar, is making a lot of policy there. So this is why I think this question of the special relationship is still relevant today. Finally, on Ukraine, the chief military official of NATO, Sir Stuart Peach, was in Ukraine at the height of this crisis, talking about how important Ukraine is to NATO. And so the message is being sent to Zelensky: push the Russians, talk about taking back Crimea, driving the ethnic Russians who make up the majority of the population into submission in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And this is being directed by the Biden administration, but the hand behind it is that of British intelligence. Just as in 2014 at the coup in Maidan Square, Biden was the Obama overseer, but on the scene was none other than Christopher Steele, sending memos back to John Kerry, Victoria Nuland, and others in the State Department about the progress of the coup. So that's why we have to become aware of this British role. And of course, John, you've been covering some of this in relationship to the creation of the US intelligence agencies after World War II, which were largely shaped by the relationship with MI6 and the Special Operations Service of the British.
Yeah, it's fascinating how everything at some point, if you dig enough, you're going to see how it's all connected, and we connect from World War II to the present has been the subject of my studies and my show for the past 4 or 5 years at least, and now I'm realizing that in order to understand the present, we have to understand the past, and so that's part of what I'm doing now. Is I'm working on a bit of a biography of my father, which I'm working intensely on this month and for my viewers and subscribers, forgive me, but I'm not going to be reading out of my usual book readings this month in order to give myself more time to attend to the actual writing process. So with that aside, let's go back to what we started with, which was called the Caesar sanctions. And there's a couple of points here that I think it would be helpful to me and possibly others to go through just what exactly are the Caesar sanctions. And let's remind ourselves of who is Erdogan and what was Erdogan's. Remember, Sibel Edmonds had a big expose of Erdogan for in the first part of the Trump administration. There was a lot with Mike Flynn and Turkey and all of that going on. So if you could just maybe refresh us as to that and give us a definition of the Caesar sanctions. Why are they called that?
Well, let's start with that. We can get to Erdogan in a few minutes. But of course, his shadow looms large over Syria, especially Idlib province. What the story of the Caesar sanctions, another classic British intelligence operation. In 2014, someone surfaced as a so-called defector who had the responsibility for supposedly taking photographs of people who died in detention in Syrian jails. And he left Syria, turned up in London with over 50,000 photographs. And he turned that over to the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish British branch of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They're not actually ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but they're supporters of the insurgency against President Assad. And so then they passed that on to Human Rights Watch, this huge cache of photos. And Human Rights Watch produced a 89-page report out of it, which included 28,000 photos of dead people, titled "Let the Dead Speak." And then this was given to this so-called defector named Caesar to bring to the US Congress to show these photos to convince the Obama administration that more had to be done to bring down Assad. And so they had two congressional hearings where this guy appeared with a windbreaker covering his face, his whole body. You couldn't even see him. But he was accompanied by a guy named Muaz Mustafa, who is a State Department employee, but who's very close to the Syrian rebel forces. In fact, this Mustafa was the person who accompanied John McCain on his so-called fact-finding mission to Syria, where he was photographed in the company of ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters. So here you have a guy who's friendly with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who was involved in the manipulation of the John McCain, who didn't need too much manipulation to support a war, bringing this so-called defector with these photos. Now, in their report on it, Human Rights Watch said, we meticulously verified as many of these photos as possible. And we found at close to 36 cases of civilians who were killed in Syrian prisons. Now, actually, there were 30 people that they verified as civilians, 30 out of 28,000 pictures. They admit that almost half of the photos were Syrian army soldiers who had been killed by the terrorists. Another third of the pictures were ordinary civilians who were killed in bombings, in buildings collapsing because of attacks by the rebels, assassinations. And then the other 20% were photos of foreign jihadists who had been killed by the Syrian army. That's hardly a proof that Assad was doing mass killings inside Syrian prisons. But none of that was brought out when it was brought to the Congress. What was brought to the Congress is, here are 28,000 people killed by Assad. The same way they say 400 or 500,000 Syrians are dead because of Assad. So this didn't go too far when Obama was in, partly because there was a fight among some people in the Obama administration against escalating against Syria, at least openly. That didn't stop them from having the CIA and other contract forces in Syria arming and training ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the caliphate, but they didn't want to do it publicly. Then when Trump came in, Trump wanted to crush ISIS and Al-Qaeda, except for one thing. Pompeo, the Secretary of State, wanted to use this against the Russians. So Pompeo was the one who said, all right, the war didn't work. The dirty war may have killed 500,000 Syrians, but it didn't overthrow Assad. So now we're going to use sanctions. And so they introduced a bill that passed in June 2020 to sanction any individual, any company, any country that provides anything to Syria: food, medicine, fuel, parts and equipment. Anyone who does that, as Pompeo said, will be a target of these sanctions. And as a result, there's no more food imports. This had a huge impact on Lebanon, which was involved in a very brisk trade with Syria. And at the same time, the US is occupying the northeast of Syria, which is where most of the wheat is produced and where the oil is. So Syria can't sell the oil, they can't harvest the wheat, and so there's starvation as a result. And as I mentioned, the papal nuncio, Cardinal Zanari, sent out an appeal insisting that the world do something to act to save the Syrian people. And then Helga Zepp-LaRouche called on everyone who can hear this to join this appeal to make sure these sanctions are lifted. Now, sanctions, they say, well, that's an alternative to war. Well, what difference does it make if someone's killed by a bomb or if someone is starved to death or dies because they can't get medicine? This is a murderous policy. It really is a violation of the Nuremberg Tribunal, where the people imposing it knew or should have known that deaths of a large population will result if these things continue. And so we're calling on everyone to start pressuring the Congress to roll these back, that any congressman who supported this, and by the way, it was almost unanimous, is the equivalent of a Nuremberg criminal. And the way to redeem themselves is to speak out against these sanctions. So that's a summary of what these sanctions are and what the effect is.
Wow, it's the policy that was stated by George F. Kennan in an often quoted passage that he said that because we own like 50% of the world's economy, but we only have 6% of the population, that our foreign policy is going to have to be conducted in such a way that we can preserve our hegemony. And in order to do that, we cannot be empathetic. We cannot be that moral, knightly crusader character in our hearts that we really want to be the good guys. No, we cannot be the good guys and maintain our hegemony. So this was the policy that was instituted right after World War II. And the John Foster Dulles is the great craftsman of it, and his brother Alan Dulles is the great executioner of it. And from him to Henry Kissinger, who wrote the NSAM 200 about food policy, this is all part of a continuation of what can only be called a Nazi mentality, Harley.
And let me mention another point. James Jeffrey, who is the special envoy under Trump to Syria, said his job is to make Syria a quagmire for Russia. And then when the sanctions were passed, Jeffrey said, this is the way we can get a regime change without firing a shot. So it's conscious policy going from Pompeo to Blinken to Jake Sullivan to Biden, to the extent Biden is aware of this, to support the murder of millions of Syrians as a way of convincing them that they have to get rid of their government. So this is the ultimate crime of this cabal. Now, then you look at what's happening in Ukraine, where it's clear they're trying the same thing. to use Ukraine to either provoke Russia to attack, in which case, here's the question. You say you're looking back over the period from the end of World War II to the present. One of the big issues after World War II, especially after NATO was created, was would the United States risk, and after the Russians developed the hydrogen bomb, would the US risk losing New York or Washington to save Berlin or Paris? Because the idea was that if the Russians crossed over into Western Europe, our only real way of stopping them would be with nuclear war. Now, de Gaulle didn't trust the United States. He developed a decent relationship with John Kennedy eventually, but he didn't think the US would risk New York City to save Paris, so they developed their own force de frappe, their own independent nuclear force. But, this is the question again today. Zelensky is poking a stick in the eye of the bear, saying we're going to take back Crimea. Take it back from whom? I mean, the population voted 90% to align with Russia. As for the Donbass region, these two areas, Donetsk and Luhansk, over 80 to 90% of the population is Russian ethnic, and they were provoked into a revolt by the Kiev government, which had within it anti-Russian descendants of the World War II Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, the Azov Battalion, the Right Sector, the Stefan Bandera group, who in World War II, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, they joined them. They had a Ukrainian SS unit headed for a time by Bandera. And what did they do? They exterminated Romanians, Russians, Poles, Gypsies, and Jews, non-Ukrainians, ethnic cleansing. There are people in the Ukrainian defense sector and the Ukrainian security forces who march every year in honor of Stefan Bandera, who was the Ukrainian SS official. Now, is it possible that when Biden was coordinating the coup in Maidan Square and these neo-Nazis were shooting both government and anti-government protesters, that Biden didn't know the Nazis were there, that the West doesn't know these are Nazis? A man named Andrei Podobwy came to the United States in 2018. He's the leader of the Right Sector, and he was the deputy head of the Ukrainian parliament. He was taken around by a man named Carpenter, Michael Carpenter, who was an aide to Joe Biden. And he took him around and he was confronted by someone who said, "Don't you know who Podobwy is? He's a Nazi." And Carpenter said, "Oh no, he's a wonderful patriot and he's a friend of ours." But then it was exposed that this guy is still to this day an admirer of Hitler and ethnic cleansing. And so here you have Carpenter. You know what Carpenter at the time, or during the Obama administration, he was an aide to the National Security Council on Russia and Ukraine. Today, Michael Carpenter heads up the Biden Institute for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the military-industrial complex. This is who we're dealing with.
I don't know how to expose Biden any more than what is being done, but it seems that it has to be done. Joe Biden is a British agent, in my opinion. Maybe I'm not the greatest scholar in the world, but I've read enough to I think, exercise my right to express my opinion. And I think that's what we've got here, is we've got somebody executing a British policy from the presidency of the United States. And maybe not for the first time have we got that situation, if we look back at people like Harry Truman, for example. But well, that's just my 2 cents. And
maybe, Biden went with Carpenter to speak before the Council of Foreign Relations, which was originally set up by British aristocrats who wanted to make sure they connected with Wall Street and formed a joint think tank to influence U.S. policy. That was after World War I, so it was 1921 when the CFR was set up. Biden and Carpenter gave a talk there in February 2018, where Biden started by saying, I'm a proud Atlanticist. Now, Atlanticist is the code word for the British subversion of the United States, whether it's the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Center for New American Security, which for a period of time had Victoria Nuland as its head of the board. Nuland is now going back as the number 3 person in Biden's State Department after she was the person who directly oversaw the Maidan coup in 2014. And then there's something called the Jamestown Foundation, which is another one of these foundations, which is now headed by Admiral Michael Hayden, who was in charge of the NSA when they sabotaged the work of Bill Binney and others, and instead went for a metadata collection, a complete security state. It was Hayden whose work convinced Snowden he had no choice but to defect and take his documents with him. So, and who does the NSA coordinate with? GCHQ, the British equivalent of the NSA. And that's where the story of Russiagate originated, from the head of GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, who contacted John Brennan in December of 2015 and said, hey, look, we're picking up some very suspicious cyber signals from Russia. Now, no one's ever seen the evidence that he supposedly showed Brennan. But the interesting question is, why did he go to Brennan? Brennan was CIA. Why didn't he go to Admiral Rogers, the head of NSA? Because Rogers was a Russiagate skeptic. So they went to Brennan, and that's where the whole Russiagate took off from the Hannigan report, which then gave way to the Christopher Steele PP dossier saying that Putin was blackmailing Trump over incidents that occurred in a Moscow hotel. So, you look at the period, and you mentioned Harry Truman, it does go back to Truman. There's no question about it, which was very different than FDR, because FDR fought with Churchill over what would be post-war policy. And Franklin Roosevelt told Churchill, never again will American boys die to defend the interests of the British Empire.
Unfortunately, he died before he could enforce that. And his death will always be suspicious in my mind, as well as a lot of other people. So now let's go back, if we may, to the question of Turkey for a minute. And once again, we had trials with Bijan Kian and Mike Flynn about the Flynn Intelligence Group and their relationship with Turkey. All that seemed to be part of the assault on President Trump's legitimacy to keep that in the news, to keep these trials going on. But Bijan Kian, is an Iranian, and by birth at least, and the associations that were going on there seems to me to be like a business clique of people that were going to take over the energy policy in the Middle East from those that were put in there by the Obama people and the Biden people before. So that I'm wondering, to what extent is all of this warfare going on in order to establish a pipeline through Syria, but the Transmed pipeline, and to kill the Nord Stream pipeline, which is the Russian pipeline directly to Germany through the North Sea or through the Baltic, or you know what I mean. So is this all this really a couple of gangs or a bunch of gangs of hugely powerful, rich people using countries and kings and soldiers and civilians as pawns in order to gain advantage in the great game of who's controlling the energy flow into Europe?
Well, that's the fallback story, but I don't think that's the primary issue, because the geopolitics in the Middle East started before there was a real extensive knowledge of the oil that existed there. You've had the same kind of posturing from, at that time, the British Foreign Office and British intelligence that you have today. The there's certainly an element of using the oil and the money from the oil to, in a sense, grease the skids of the military-industrial complex. You say to them, well, you get the oil, you get a cutback. We can give a little bit of money to Turkey. They can use that money to buy U.S. weapons. So there is you scratch my back, we'll scratch yours. But deep down, it's not about oil. The petrodollar is a thing that's going to come and go at some point in the near future. The deeper question is that defined by Mackinder and the British when they look at this from the standpoint of geography. And what do they see in the Middle East? It's the crossroads of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, these were the arteries, these were the channels, I should say, that the British used to control international trade. And the choke points, the Port of Aden, the Cape of Good Hope in southern South Africa, Gibraltar, the Suez Canal. The British let the French build the Suez Canal, and then they foreclosed on it and took it over. Right now, the gates of Istanbul, the strait there, is another area that the British are interested in. They're intending to create as much conflict as possible to prevent a Eurasian, Western European, African alliance, which is what they fear more than anything else. They don't worry about losing the oil. They're trying to shut down fossil fuels in any case. Now, they used the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions as a way to punish Europe and to punish Russia. But it's not primarily about fuel, and people get confused about this because in the United States, people think of the television show Dallas, that money flows from oil and oil controls everything. But that's not true. The British view is different. It's geopolitics was designed by a member of the Royal Geographical Society. That's what Mackinder was. And he used charts and maps to show how the various choke points of the world affect the British control of trade. So that's why it's a long answer for me to be saying that when you look at Erdogan, he's not driven primarily by oil profits. He wants to reestablish the old Ottoman Caliphate. This is a pure power move. He didn't like the ISIS Caliphate because he thought he should be the caliph. And the Ottoman Empire was a very powerful empire for a long time. But if you look at where World War I came from, it was the intersection of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. And for the British, controlling the Middle East or Southwest Asia was the primary consideration because they knew the Ottoman Empire would collapse. So the question was, how can you replace them so that the Russians can't move into the Middle East? Now, with Erdogan, there's a British special relationship now with Turkey. Turkey's not so popular with the rest of Europe for a whole variety of reasons, including criminal enterprises that are run from there, possibly including Erdogan's own office. But Putin has tried to deal with him the way Putin tends to deal with these things, on a power relationship. But it's clear you can't get a deal with Erdogan. He in a sense, turned his back on Trump. He's turning his back on Putin. He's continuing to have territorial ambitions in Syria and looking at the oil in the Eastern Mediterranean as a possible Turkish find. So I think he's someone who is easily manipulable by the British. And that's why this Richard Moore connection is so important. Who ever heard of the ambassador to Turkey becoming the head of MI6? Usually they promote from the inside of the intelligence community. And he was an intelligence insider, but he was deployed for a specific reason, which is the British interest in these geographical choke points and these ports and canals and so on. And most importantly, preventing the connection between Europe, Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa.
I'm going to indulge in relaying a question from the chat room, which I think may be interesting. TCG asks the question, if we give up the special relationship with Britain, then where do we go from there? What is his comment is there's no disinterested realpolitik. In other words, realpolitik is something we have to bow down to. And so the question is, well, if we don't hook ourselves to the star of Great Britain, then what are we going to do? Are we just going to drift, or what's the answer to that one?
Simple. What's the benefit of the special relationship? We ended up in two world wars where the British were trying to make the United States their special partner. And after World War II, after we bailed them out for a second time, they moved in on Truman and convinced Truman to use the wall, the Iron Curtain, as a basis of defining post-war policy. So in a sense, you had, again, two empires. Now, the answer to the question and it starts from an interesting standpoint. What is the true national interest of the United States? Is it that we have a security state at home and a military deployed all over the world as the Roman legion was deployed? I mean, one of the interesting things to look at in looking at the British is one of the reasons they wanted the United States to be the military enforcer of British policy is they studied the collapse of the Roman Empire and realized that Rome had too many soldiers, too many of their native sons deployed all over the world, and they were unable to continue to protect internally the population. So the British said, well, we've got to recruit people who become more British than the British, which they did in using the caste system in India, which they have done with the Rhodes Scholarship and other kinds of means of controlling the United States. So do we benefit from this? The Five Eyes, the intelligence eyes, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, they were all involved in Russiagate. They all had a special role. Actually, maybe not New Zealand, but Australia, Canada, and the UK did. So what would be the alternative? Well, go back in history. When we were fighting for freedom from the British Empire, who were the American allies? The most important ones were France and Russia, something called the League of Armed Neutrality, in which the Tsarina Catherine and the French, in particular the Marquis de Lafayette, but also people like Baron von Steuben, a Prussian, were involved in supporting the American revolutionaries against the British. The Civil War, when the British were preparing to blockade the northern ports, it was Russia again, Tsar Alexander II, who stepped in and said, if they try to do a blockade, we'll send our navy. And they sent the Russian naval vessels into San Francisco and the port of New York to back us up. Both world wars, we were allied with Russia. And in fact, in World War II, while the British were very weak, and you know what they said about Montgomery is the Germans said he was their favorite general because they knew he wouldn't fight. On the other hand, the Russians did fight, and they had horrible losses in the war. Now, the problem we have with Russia is communism, the Bolshevik Revolution, which, by the way, was partly a British operation. The first revolution in Russia against the Tsar was to make sure that the Russians stayed in World War I. And it was a heavy British influence on the Kerensky government and so on. So in any case, if you just go through the history, at every one of these crucial moments, the British in the 20th century, the British brought the United States into war. Southeast Asia, the same thing, the Vietnam War. The French left. Eisenhower wasn't keen on getting into that war. Kennedy wasn't keen on it. But the Brits were insisting the United States had to go in to stop communism. Now, Russia's no longer communist. Russia wants to develop its economy. There are some very innovative scientists and thinkers in Russia. Could we have an alliance with Russia to break the power of the City of London? Because Russia and the United States have the capability as industrial powers, as military powers, to not have to bow down to the International Monetary Fund, the City of London, NATO, and these other supranational institutions. So the long answer is we need to find common ground with Russia and with China. And in fact, if you think about it, John, I know you've been doing these series of broadcasts with my colleagues who wrote the pamphlet against the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. Interesting developments just over the last week. John Kerry was in India to talk to the Indians about coming to Biden's Earth Day summit and supporting the full Green New Deal. And the Indian energy minister said to him, well, it's well and good for you to do that because you put out a lot of greenhouse gases and a lot of pollution. But there are 800 million people in Africa who want development, and your policy will deny that to them. And then Kerry went to Modi. He went over the head of the energy minister to try and get Modi to go along with him. And Modi said, no, it's true. We want development for our country as well. Maybe 2050, maybe we can do something then, but now we want to develop. Then Kerry went to China and got the same reaction. The Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, came out with a story today saying that, well, while the United States now wants China to cooperate and collaborate on the Green New Deal, they're opposing us on every other front. Well, what do we want? We want economic development, and we want that for the poorest countries in the world. They need the space for industrial development, not to continue to be sources of cheap labor and cheap raw materials for the Western banks. So from Russia, China, and India, you have opposition to a policy which will destroy the United States. So why don't we join with them instead of sticking with this Green New Deal, which originated from the British royal family, from the Davos crowd, from the oligarchs of Central and Western Europe, of the Club of Rome, and the global agendas that have been produced. So I think that answers the question.
I think so. It was an interesting springboard to get some background, and I think that's what we need to do, is to give people the historical background to show that what Harley just said is absolutely correct. And there's a tremendous amount of love, of Anglophilia in this country. The worshiping of the royal family and traditions and desire. Everybody wants to go to see London, and I want to. It's our cultural guide stone in a way.
Except for the Irish.
Well, wait a minute now. Let's make a special case about the Irish. Matter of fact, we need to have a whole show just on the Irish, since you bring it up, Harley. But no, let's just talk about the British as the beloved cultural icons of America, because and honestly. To personalize it a minute, I'm fifth generation Irish immigrant. So, and getting back to what you were saying earlier about giving up your old traditions and becoming part of the empire, that's exactly what my family went through, and that's exactly what my father was subjected to as his career developed, and he started to realize, hey, this is not good for America. This is what we're doing here, and I'll be explaining that more as I write as I publish the book. But the Irish experience in America has been opened up, through decades and decades of sacrifice. You can read about the Irish, in the Civil War, supposedly earning, their citizenship, but however, still kept in ghettos and voting blocks to be controlled by powerful forces, much like the dictators of small countries today. The Irish were used as peasants to vote for the people that ultimately were going to stab them in the back. But that whole dynamic has kind of melted away in America, where most people of Irish American background, they don't hate Great Britain anymore. They think of themselves, well, America, Britain, special relationship. Getting back to that.
Well, that's been a very intense brainwashing operation for so long. The
Yes.
idea of we share a common language and a common heritage. Well, to tell you the truth, I have nothing against the people of England. The people of England are also victims of the monarchical system. The caste system, you talk about the caste system in India, but what about in Britain? You just look at this funeral that just took place, where you had the royal family on display. And I thought it was really kind of interesting to see the picture from St. Paul's where the Queen is sitting all by herself, all alone. For what purpose? I mean, what was that designed to show? Because these things don't happen accidentally. They try to create a cult out of the monarchy. And this is why it's so useful for people to read Shakespeare, because Shakespeare dismantles in his time this idea of the wonderful divine right of kings. Nowhere better than in the great history play Henry V, where you have today neoconservatives were arguing that Henry V was a great king. He was a wastrel as a kid. He was not very, he was a drunkard. He ran around with Falstaff. But once he became king, he fought for the British nation. He did so much for Britain. And they were comparing George W. Bush to him. But they missed the punchline. The next play, Henry VI, starts with England in ruins. They're driven out of France. Henry is dead. His son, Henry VI, is 18 months old and controlled by the old factions that were mostly concerned with making sure that the church property didn't get taxed. So the whole mythology that's built up, Shakespeare rips to shreds, but the way it's taught these days, no one gets it. That's part of the brainwashing. And that's why we really have to keep Shakespeare in the public schools and actually have teachers who are competent to teach it, because these were profiles of a ruling generation, the Plantagenets initially, and then the Tudors, and then the last plays were at the time when Queen Elizabeth was dying. No one knew who would replace her. Clearly, Shakespeare's company depended on the sponsorship of the Stuarts, but Shakespeare had no great love of the Stuart monarchy either. And of course, then England went into a civil war. So if you really read Shakespeare, you get a sniff of what this monarchical system is all about. The pomp and circumstance covers the graft, the corruption, the evil nature of the idea of a monarchy, of lords and ladies in this kind of class society. So the best thing about the United States is that we had, at least in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, waves of immigrants who came in who were given an opportunity to join the middle class. My relatives came in from Eastern Europe and ended up sending all their kids to college and professions, getting professional degrees and things of that sort. Now we see people trying to turn that back, saying that, well, it's not the same with Africans or Latin Americans or others. So, we're almost embarking on a British style eugenics policy, the idea that some people are better than others by birth. And if you're not one of those people, you shouldn't expect anything. And that goes against the ideas of the American tradition and the Constitution.
Absolutely. Shakespeare has been a mystery to me for my whole life, but I've never given up on trying to understand Shakespeare. And within the past few years, I've found a lot of enlightenment just through the application of, for instance, being playing roles in the Verity Shakespearean Othello and Macbeth,
Awesome.
and I mean, just fabulous way to look at it. and you see how, so many layers of Shakespeare. And I've been watching, Harley, I recommend to everyone to look at on YouTube, a man named Hank Whittemore, which I suspect may be related to James Whittemore, the great actor. Hank Whittemore has done a show called Shakespeare the Traitor, and it is fantastic. His theory is that it's the Earl of Oxford who is writing under the pen name of Shakespeare, and it's all about Southampton being the actual real heir to the throne, who is pushed aside by Cecil in favor of his favorite, our own James the First, who changed the history of England in so many ways, but allowed the colonization of America to proceed. So a lot there, but I think Hank Whittemore's presentation called Shakespeare the Traitor on YouTube, I can't recommend it highly enough. It really is quite good.
That sounds interesting. I'll take a look at it.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of folks with Larouche Organization are great Shakespeare scholars, and the folks with Schiller Institute. It's a world of beautiful language that we can hardly even understand anymore, but it's well worth it. It repays the time you put into it 10 times over.
You want to know something interesting? You mentioned the Schiller Institute. When they were trying to rewrite Shakespeare in the 18th century in England to make it more accessible to the common people, it was Gotthold Lessing who launched a translation project to translate Shakespeare into German, into the German, High German that corresponded to Shakespeare's English, and literally saved Shakespeare from the butchers who were trying to chop it down, try and make it like a comic book version of Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. And Lessing and his closest collaborator, Moses Mendelssohn, were among the predecessors for Schiller and Schiller's idea of the aesthetical education of man. And there was a whole grouping. In fact, you look at Mozart, the person who wrote the Magic Flute with him, his collaborator Schikaneder, was the head of a Shakespearean acting company, carrying out Lessing's goal to have a national theater in Germany. So the history of culture is full of these kinds of connections, where you find people who were trying to shape a better world for the average person through powerful ideas as opposed to money and privilege. And I think that's why Lyndon LaRouche was so committed to the ideas of Schiller. And of course, his wife Helga is a Schiller scholar.
I hope one day to interview her on my show. I'd be so thrilled to do that. And that's it. One of the things that Marcia Maluk of the LaRouche Organization has been saying to me and over again is that art is politics. Politics is art, and look at Shakespeare as a prime example of that. We have to wade through centuries of language changes and different times, different customs, different settings, and etc. But
and falsifications of history. That's the other thing you have to wade through.
I'm sorry, and what?
Falsifications of history, which have been done deliberately.
Yeah,
distort what the issues, the fundamental issues are. We're going to be putting out again our culture magazine. We had stopped it for a while, just partly because of publishing costs. But we will be starting a cultural magazine, Leonora. And again, if people are interested in these kinds of questions, they can always get in touch with us. I'll give out my personal email address if people want to hear how to get my daily blog, my daily updates. You can write to me at harleysch@gmail.com. It's harleysch@gmail.com. And I have an ongoing correspondence with a number of your listeners who I'm very happy to be in touch with.
Yeah, that's great. We always have a very active chat room when you're on the show. I notice that too. It's very stimulating for people to think of of good questions for Harley Schlanger. So send them in to Harley at his Gmail address. And well, Harley, thanks again for being with us today. A fabulous conversation as always. And I'm going to get back into my Shakespeare as soon as I finish my own humble writing project that I hope to finish by June 6th, which is the 50th anniversary of my father's death. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to keep in mind all of the stuff that we've been studying today together. Ukraine, well, I got two questions left and I got 1 minute to say them. So let me take advantage of your being here. Number one, do you really think that Ukraine could explode into war, or is this just all a bunch of bluff to try to get more money for the defense industry? And number two, is Joe Biden really going to pull out of Afghanistan?
Well, on Ukraine, I think you look at the military industrial complex, they're calling for more money for China, more money for dealing with Russia, more money to pull out of Afghanistan, more money to stay in Syria. A lot of this is about money. On the other hand, the Ukrainian right wing is putting enormous pressure on Zelensky. They've threatened to kill him. And he had to do this, I think, to show them that he's standing up for their interests. NATO shouldn't exist. The NATO is trying to use this for their purpose. And the Russians are just trying to make sure that there's not going to be nuclear missiles on their border. And I think Putin is level-headed. He's a serious thinker, but you better not push him too far because there is a red line there, and the Russians are serious about that red line.
Will the United States give up New York for Kiev? Kiev?
Let's hope not. It's a bad trade.
All right, Afghanistan?
It's hard to say. I think there are people in the military who want to stay. Bolton, Petraeus, and others are saying we've got to stay there. But I think what Biden did say, 20 years is enough. I think at least someone around him learned the lesson of Trump's victory in 2016, that Americans don't want to stay in these wars that show nothing of benefit to the American people.
But who's going to protect the opium fields if we leave?
Well, let the Brits do it.
All right, let the Brits do it. Harley Schlanger, once again, thank you so million for being with us. Thanks, everybody. I will see you. Well, I think I'll be off until Thursday because I'm hoping to concentrate on my writing. So we'll see you then. Good afternoon, Harley, and everyone have a great day. Bye now.